In this lecture, we're going to review the way households get paid for labor. Wage determination. We're going to explain why labor productivity and real hourly compensation track so closely over time. We're going to show how wage rates and employment levels are determined in a competitive labor market. We'll demonstrate how monopsony, a market with a single employer, can reduce wages below competitive levels. And then finally, we're going to discuss how unions increase wage rates by pursuing the demand enhancement model, the craft union model, or the industrial union model. We're going to look at all three of these to show the differences and similarities between these union models. Wages are the price paid to households for labor's resource. Whether you're a salaried employee getting paid monthly or an hourly employee getting paid on a weekly basis, there are two components of compensation: wages and fringe benefits, such as medical insurance, paid vacations, paid holidays, and in some very progressive companies, childcare. The wage rate is paid by employers monthly or weekly. The nominal wage is what is reflected on the W-2 statement. The real wage considers the deterioration in purchasing power due to the effects of inflation. Not everybody gets paid the same. The general level of wages differ among nations, and they certainly differ among occupations. Ditch diggers do not get the same wage as brain surgeons. Here is a graphic example of hourly wages of production workers for selected nations around the globe. The United States here is shown on the blue bar at about $34 an hour. Sweden and Germany are much higher at $45 an hour. A current comparison is available in the data folder in this module. Labor productivity has a significant influence over an employer's ability to increase the pay for labor's resource. What have real wages done over time in the United States? They've increased. There has also been an increase in the demand for labor as reflected in this chart. We have real wages on the vertical axis and the quantity of labor demanded on the horizontal axis. Importantly, real wages in the United States have increased over an extended period of time and are expected to increase moving forward. The growth in the nominal median weekly wage from 1999 to 2007 has increased about 3.3% on average. After taking inflation into account, the real wage has increased by 0.5% per year. A similar increase in the real wage has happened since 2007. Real wages have gone up in the United States over an extended period, as I've mentioned, and the increase is closely correlated with the increase in the output per hour of work, or the productivity of the workforce. In terms used from previous lectures, the marginal product of labor has increased significantly over the time frame shown on this graph. There are a number of reasons that labor productivity has increased over time. The two most important are, as shown on the right here, plentiful capital. Firms in the United States have invested in capital, machinery, and equipment. This significant investment has increased the country's production possibilities curve and the ability of labor to produce more goods. Likewise, the workforce in the United States is healthy and well-trained. Thus, the quality of labor, in conjunction with increased capital, has contributed to the increase in productivity and the increase in wages. Let's now look at how the equilibrium wage rate is established in the market. First, the market demand for labor is downward sloping, no different than any other demand curves. Labor demand in an industry sector is determined by the sum of all firms in the sector that demand a specific labor resource. For example, in the building sector, the industry demand for carpenters is the sum of all firms in the sector who need carpenters. The market supply for labor is upward sloping. The supply of labor depends upon the competition among industries and the wage rate. If the wage rate for carpenters increases, there may be a shift from those looking for work as lower paid bricklayers. Market equilibrium for wages happens where the marginal revenue product equals the marginal resource cost at the market wage. This concept was reviewed in a previous lecture. This graph displays the total demand and supply of labor in a competitive market sector on the left, and an individual firm's participation on the right. On the left-hand side, the downward sloping demand curve in green and the upward sloping supply curve results in an equilibrium wage rate of $10 at WC. And the quantity of labor supplied at QC, or 1,000 workers, for the market. Okay, for the market. The individual firm on the right must pay this equilibrium wage rate for the 5 workers that they need, as no individual firm can influence the market wage rate. The marginal resource cost, MRC, is a flat $10 in a competitive market, as each new employee gets the same wage. The individual firm maximizes its profit where MRP equals MRC. We have just reviewed how a wage rate gets determined in a competitive market, the result of demand and supply. In the balance of this lecture, we will look at demand and supply situations in imperfectly competitive markets and how those imperfections change the wage rate. The first example is referred to as the monopsony model. In this model, the employer has significant labor buying power. What are the characteristics? Think of it as a company town. where the firm is the significant single buyer of labor. A region or local area where the firm has significant influence over the economy. In these cases, the firm is basically the single purchaser of labor. They are the wage maker rather than the wage taker from the competitive market. As a result, the firm maximizes profit by hiring less workers. The labor supply in this situation is upward sloping, but labor is relatively immobile, both outside the specific location and among different types of businesses within the location, including the ability to get additional skill training. Thus, the labor supply curve is to the left of the competitive supply curve. Because of this demand and supply situation, the equilibrium wage rate is lower than what the competitive wage rate would be. The firm doesn't get to be influenced by the wage rate in the market like the competitive market does. You need a carpenter, you're going to pay that $10 on the previous chart. In this market, the firm's the wage maker. It decides what it's going to pay, and ultimately they pay lower than the competitive wage. Let's take a look at this. This chart lays out graphically what was just discussed. The demand and supply curve of the monopsony model is shown here. In a competitive market, the equilibrium wage rate would be leveled at point A, the intersection of the downward sloping demand curve, MRP, and the upward sloping supply curve. Okay? Because the monopsonist can set the wage and can restrict hiring to maximize profits, their supply curve is to the left of the competitive supply curve. Why? When a monopsonist pays a higher wage rate to attract the next worker, it must pay that higher wage to all the workers currently employed. Otherwise there'd be revolt. Thus, the natural equilibrium point is point B. The monopsonist MPC curve reflects the sum of the new worker's wage rate and the amount necessary to bring the wage rate of all current workers up to the new wage level. Thus, there is an incentive to restrict demand. Remember, small town, everybody knows the firm is the wage taker. If they needed more labor, okay, and they needed in a classical situation not to pay the 10, but to pay the 11 now to attract that new additional worker, then they have to pay everybody 11. Like I said, otherwise there would be revolt. So what happens here? Basically, they restrict supply and keep the wage rate lower than what a competitive situation would be. The monopsonist wage is at point C, below the competitive wage because they are the wage maker and they hire less workers to achieve this at QM. The firm in a monopsony model has the power to do this. Now let's look at a situation where labor has more power. The final portion of this lecture will look at three types of union models that influence wages and labor demand and supply. The first is the demand enhancement model. Many unions do not have enough power to make firms increase hiring. The decision to hire is that of the firms. In a demand enhancement model, union representatives undertake lobbying and promotions that try to influence the demand for projects that the firm produces or projects that the firm is bidding on. The hope is that demand for the product or projects goes up and the firm will hire more labor. For example, construction workers have lobbied for new highways, mass transit systems, and stadium projects. Unions in the aerospace industry have lobbied to increase spending on the military. They're looking to shift the labor demand curve to the right from D1 to D2 in an indirect manner. Historically, the advertising tagline, "Look for the union label," was an attempt at demand enhancement in the clothing industry. The second version is the craft union model. To improve wages, the union attempts to restrict the supply of labor rather than increase the demand for labor. At times, these unions actively promote legislation that restricts immigration and child labor. They also push for earlier retirement and shorter work weeks, all methods to reduce the supply of labor. Craft union models also organize around rules of entry. The organization of iron workers, electrical workers, and carpenters are attempt to restrict supply by only allowing work to be done by union members. Non-union members are restricted from working unless they join the union. Occupational licensing is in the gaming business, or even nurses, is a craft union approach to restrict supply. Some craft union models are very sophisticated, like the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association, where specific entry and educational requirements restrict supply. On the positive side, these types of entry requirements and licensing restrictions protect consumers by ensuring a certain level of quality. Craft unions are always looking to shift the supply curve to the left and keep wages higher than in a competitive market. Competitive market here being the wage of WC and the quantity demanded of QC, competitive. The craft union model now is at WU for a wage by restricting supply at QU. The industrial union model is the third. It tries to organize as much of the supply of labor as they can, skilled, semi-skilled, and unskilled worker. At the same time, they try and get the highest wage possible for each group, at times under the threat of a wide-ranging strike. The firm becomes the wage taker. This type of union model is present in the automotive industry for the Detroit 3 and the steel industry. Note, Toyota and Honda do not have workers that belong to a union. The industrial union model here tries to increase the quantity supplied as represented by point E. They just try to get as many people organized, even if it is higher than the natural demand in a competitive situation at WC and QC on this graph. They want it at E, at QE. Yet the primary goal is higher wages. They demand a wage represented by point A. The wage is above the competitive rate of WC. Likewise, the supply curve becomes perfectly elastic, as firms can't hire someone unless they pay the union wage. Likewise, individual workers cannot offer to work for less than the union wage, for less than WU. There is no supply. Due to the situation of the high wage and benefits, firms are reluctant to add employees unless it's absolutely necessary and the long-range demand outlook for products is positive. In essence, labor demand is restricted at point B. Recently, General Motors agreed to hire more workers, but at a lower wage rate negotiated after bankruptcy. Thus, they have a two-tier wage system that the union will try to eliminate over time. To conclude, a competitive market generates the highest unemployment. All other imperfect models generate higher wages and less employment. The exception there is the monopsony model, but for the purposes of the overall structure and fabric of the United States, typically they're in a competitive situation or in a union situation, so I'm making that comparison. Again, I want to emphasize that a competitive market generates the highest employment level, but as we've seen on a number of these graphs, do not generate the highest wage level.